Strapping yourself into a tiny capsule on top of what is essentially a large controlled explosion is one of the hazards of being an astronaut. But if things do really go wrong, then it's nice to know there's an escape system of some sort to get you out of there. But how can you escape an exploding rocket if things do go with a bang in all the wrong ways? This video is sponsored by Readly. Now, back when I was 12 in 1974, I got into electronics as a hobby, and every month I used to buy the electronics magazines like Practical Electronics, ETI and Lector. I was also really into the early electronic music like Kraftwerk, Tangerine Dream, Tomita, Vangelis. So much so that I combined the electronics with a love of synths and built a synthesizer from the articles in the magazines when I was 15. 43 years on and I still dabble in electronics and I still love synthesizers, but all the knowledge I gained back then I got from those hobbyist magazines, and I bought hundreds of the things over the years. However, I've recently discovered Readly. Readly is an app a bit like Spotify for magazines. You pay one monthly subscription, but you get access to over 5,000 magazines from all over the world, which you can view on your smartphone or tablet. So it's paper free and you don't end up with huge piles of the things all over the place when you've finished. I've also found one of the magazines I used to read years ago called Future Music. It's still going. But using the search facility, I found another called Electronic Sound, which I'd never heard of. But it's got loads of great articles on many of the electronic artists from the 70s, 80s and right up to the present day. Much of which I am still in love with and I haven't seen on the net before. Readly's also got all the usual big name magazines on there, but there are loads of other more niche magazines on subjects which I'm also interested in, such as space, science, computing and history. The only problem is I just don't have enough time to read them all. But you may well have extra time on your hands. And if you purchase Readly, you'll get 1 month's free, then it's £7.99 per month, and you can cancel at any time. I highly recommend that you check this out with the link in the description because I've certainly found a few really interesting reads in there, and I'm going to continue subscribing to this. And with that, let's get on with the video. One of the great problems that engineers had to face when sending the first humans into space was how to save them should something catastrophic happen during the launch, which in the early days before Apollo was actually quite common. On the early manned missions, there were two main schools of thought on launch escape systems. The first was that originated by the American Maxime Faget, the designer of the Mercury spacecraft in 1958. He proposed a solid rocket motor puller system that would be attached to the crew capsule by a tower, which would fire in the event of a rocket malfunction and then pull the crew capsule away from the main rocket and float down to Earth by parachute. The second was to use ejection seats, similar to a jet aircraft. This was used by the Soviets on their Vostok rockets, which included the one which launched the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin, and also on the US Gemini missions, which came after the Mercury and their rocket-based launch escape system. The ejection seat system was simpler and lighter, but it had several drawbacks and was limited to about the first 40 seconds of flight, because after that time the speed of a rocket was too fast to safely eject from. However, if there was a problem with the rocket on either the launch pad or within the first 20 seconds of flight and the ejection seats were fired, then they could be still too close to the ground and there wouldn't be enough time to deploy the parachute. In the Soviet system, large nets were placed around the launch pad to catch the ejector seats if they fired before the rocket took off. But then that placed the crew in an extremely dangerous position, being close to a rocket if it exploded. The chief designer of the early Soviet missions, Sergei Korolev, said that he felt terrible about the inadequate system for crew escape in the opening seconds of a launch. But the Soviet ejector system was also used during the descent of each returning Vostok capsule. At about 7,000 meters or 23,000 feet, the cosmonaut would eject and then land by parachute, because the landing of the capsule itself was a very rough procedure and would more than likely cause serious injury to anyone inside. This was one of the reasons why the US landed their capsules in the sea. A parachute splashdown is less of a shock to land in the water than one coming down to land on the land. The now almost standard type of launch escape system uses variations of Maxime Faget's design, with solid or hypergolic rocket motors carrying the crew capsules away from the main rocket body. The main advantage of this is that the crew are protected from the atmosphere if the incident occurs later on and high up in the launch at high speed, and if it happens on the launch pad, they can be carried away quickly from a potentially exploding rocket in less than a second. In 1959, just a few months after the contract was signed for the Mercury project, the first tests were carried out on the rockets for the Launch Escape System, or the LES. These were mounted on a trellis-like tower and fixed to the crew capsule, and they could operate within a fraction of a second of a problem being detected. A new small solid rocket-powered booster called Little Joe was built to test the LES under real conditions. In later tests, a rhesus monkey was placed into the crew capsule to measure the G-forces and the stresses on a living creature. Within 16 months of the start of the Mercury program, the successful test of an off-the-pad abort was carried out on a production spacecraft, carrying it to a height of about 600 meters or 2,000 feet, but it wouldn't be long before a real-life emergency would test the system out. On the 21st of November 1960, the first full unmanned test flight of the Mercury Redstone 1 was carried out. But due to an error in which the order in which the control and power cables should have separated, the rocket's control system shut the engine down when it was a few inches off the pad, gaining the nickname of the 4-inch launch. This caused the rocket to drop back down onto the pad and act like it was at 40,000 feet or 12,000 meters, and ejecting the tower and the antenna parachute, just as it was meant to do, but it left the rocket standing fully fueled and unsupported on the launch pad. It was decided to leave the rocket balanced on the launch pad until the next morning, when the batteries had depleted and the liquid oxygen had boiled off before the technicians could move in and make it safe. Although the Mercury went on to be a successful program, the following Gemini mission reverted to ejection seats, something which Maxime Faget was opposed to, not only for the same reasons as the Soviets had misgivings for, but also he thought that the crew could end up being launched through the Titan's rocket exhaust plume. The main reason for the change was that the designer of the Gemini spacecraft, Jim Chamberlain, thought that the tower system of the Mercury would add much more weight than ejection seats. We have to remember that the Gemini Titan II missile was like many of the early rockets, which were basically modified ballistic or intercontinental ballistic missiles and not built for human space transport like the later Apollo. This meant that the payload weight was much more of an issue, and the tower, which was discarded as the rocket reached space, could be seen as an unnecessary and heavy requirement if the crew could be removed from the spacecraft in an emergency situation with a lighter alternative method. It was also thought that in the event of a launch pad rocket explosion, the use of hypergolic fuels in the Titan would create a smaller fireball and explosion compared to the Mercury, and therefore it didn't necessitate a Mercury-style launch escape system. A lot of work was done to provide an ejection seat system that could cope with the mission demands from the launch pad right up to 70,000 feet, and was much more sophisticated than the aircraft ejector seats of the time. And although Gemini 6A came close to using them when the rocket shut down 1.5 seconds into the launch, they were never actually used for a real manned ejection. After the Gemini program was over, Maxime Faget said that the best thing about it was that no one ever had to make an escape from it. Although Apollo followed Gemini, Apollo reverted to the Puller rocket system similar to Mercury, but was a larger system and also included a shroud that would cover the front of the command module and its windows, not only to protect it from the rocket exhaust should the escape system be needed, but also as a heat shield to protect it from the atmosphere during launch. This whole subsystem, including the shroud, was 10 meters long and weighed 3,630 kilos, Still a considerable weight to carry, but the Saturn was a much bigger and much more powerful rocket than the Mercury Redstone, and it would also be jettisoned at 295,000 feet or 90 kilometres, just on the edge of space. The Apollo system could operate automatically during the first 100 seconds, after which it would be automatically turned off. It could also be manually triggered by the astronaut at any time from the pad to its jettison altitude. If it was on the pad, the LES would launch the command module to a height of around 4,000 feet or 1,200 metres. In its automatic mode, part of the system used 3 wires which ran down the side of the main booster to detect if the structure of the rocket was starting to break up. This was unintentionally tested during a test in November 1965. Again, a little Joe was being used as the test rocket to launch up to 10,000 feet or 3,000 metres, and then fire the launch escape system. But due to a setup error in the roll gyros, as little Joe rose up, it began to roll faster and faster until it eventually broke up. The escape system monitor wires down the side of the rocket were severed, and the escape rocket fired and lifted the command module up and away exactly as it was supposed to. Although the rocket in the test had actually failed, the launch escape system had worked perfectly, and as such, it turned out to be the ideal test. Luckily, none of the Apollo missions required the use of the launch escape system. Sadly, for the Space Shuttle, on the 2 occasions of the Challenger and Columbia disasters, there were no means of escape from the shuttle. Only the first 2 shuttles, Enterprise and Columbia, had ejection seats because they were designed to be flown with a crew of 2 during its development. These were removed once the rest of the crew seats in the lower deck were fitted, and all the following shuttles had normal seats. The reason for not using them was summed up by the STS-1 pilot Robert Crippen, who said that once the solid rocket boosters were running, even if you managed to eject safely, you would probably end up going through the fire trail from the SRBs, and if you survived that, then your parachute would have burned up. And by the time the SRBs had detached, you were too high and too fast for an ejection seat system anyway, something which all the crews had to accept. With Columbia, the breakup occurred during re-entry at hypersonic speeds, where there was no chance that they could have survived in an ejector seat even if they had them. In the subsequent crew survivability report, the investigation team said that there were no known spacesuit technologies available other than the shuttle's crew module itself that could have saved them, and that disintegrated along with the rest of the shuttle. The Soviet Buran shuttle had ejection seats too, again but only for a 2-man crew, and they only worked up to 30,000 feet or 9,000 metres. As the only launch before the program was shut down was a fully automated one with no crew, we don't know whether they would have been kept or removed like the US shuttles. With the recent resurgence in space missions by NASA and private companies like SpaceX, Boeing and Blue Origin, the launch escape systems of Apollo have been brought back and updated with a modern twist and technology. NASA's new Artemis program, which will hopefully return the man to the moon by 2024, continues in a similar way to Apollo and will use an updated launch abort system, or an LAS. And this is again designed to be jettisoned after the launch to reduce the weight carried during the deep space flights. Using the same type of puller rocket system as Apollo, it's the most powerful yet built, and it needs to be to outrun the 8.8 million pounds of thrust from the SLS rocket. The new escape rockets consist of the abort motor, which will pull the Orion capsule up and away, and an attitude control motor that sits at the top of the tower. The attitude control motor is the first solid rocket motor designed for vectored thrust and uses the length of the tower as a leverage to change the direction of the escape system so as to get as far away from the SLS rocket as possible. Basically, the whole subsystem, including the Orion, will become its own aircraft. After the Orion has been moved to a safe position, the launch abort tower will be ejected and the Orion will splash down by parachute. This is in contrast to the SpaceX Dragon 2. Its launch abort system uses rocket motors which are part of the spacecraft itself, and push the spacecraft up and away rather than pull it. Whilst this adds weight which will not be ejected at the end of the launch, the major difference here is that they are designed to ferry crew and cargo to and from the ISS and are not designed to go into deep space to the moon and beyond like the NASA Artemis Orion system. The Dragon 2 uses 8 Super Draco hypergolic rocket engines, the fuels of which combust on contact with each other. Whilst these fuels are highly toxic, they are very stable whilst in space and going through the multiple day-night heating and cooling cycles each 24-hour period when they are docked to the ISS, something that solid rocket motor fuels can have a problem with and become unstable. Because the rocket engines of the Dragon 2 are contained within the body of the craft and the craft is designed to be reusable, so are the engines, which cuts down the costs, whereas the Artemis Orion launch abort tower is ejected after the launch and is not reusable. Because the Dragon 2 lands in the sea, it can't be reused for manned flights again, but it can be reused for cargo flights going forward. But the Super Draco engines can be reused for further manned flights. As the Super Draco engines are built in and not ejected at the end of a launch, they can also provide propulsion whilst being in space and do things like the orbital boosting of the ISS. They were also due to be used for the propulsive landing of the Dragon 2 like the Falcon 9 boosters do, but in 2017 SpaceX dropped that idea in favour of a parachute splashdown because of the difficulties in making the propulsive landing system man-rated and issues with the landing legs coming through the heat shield. Both Blue Origin with the New Shepard and Boeing with the CTS-100 Starliner will be using reusable spacecraft with similar pusher rocket abort systems to the Dragon 2. The next few years will be an exciting time for space. Hopefully none of these launch escape systems will be needed in an emergency, but if they are, the crews will have the best escape systems so far developed. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to thumbs up, click the bell notification and subscribe. Oh, and a big thank you to all our patrons for their ongoing support.